Welcome, I'm your host Matt, and you're listening to Homicidal Tendency. Join me as we explore the darker side of the rainbow, as we dissect the grit of queer true crime and the gore of our favorite horror flicks. It's scary, it's campy, and it's always killer. Welcome back to part 2 of episode 2. So we'll start off by recapping part 1, and then we'll jump right back in where we left off. But before that, before we get to the good stuff, I want to wish everyone a very happy holidays. Whether you're celebrating Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, or the winter solstice, or just soaking up the seasonal spirit, I hope your week is full of warmth, good food, and even better company. All right, let's recap part 1. If you haven't listened to part 1, might I suggest that you go back and listen to it to get the full details, because we're just going to touch on high levels. So, McArthur's childhood was a masterclass in performance. He was raised in a strict religious rural household. His parents were pillars of the community and professional foster parents. He grew up seeing a clear divide in between bad and broken children, the fosters, and himself, the good son. This caused repression. In recognizing his sensitivity and sexuality early on, he learned to bury his true self, his underlayers. He did chores, church choir, and built this hypermasculinity to avoid the sense of being a defective person. For over 20 years, McArthur followed a survival guide to normalcy. He married his high school sweetheart and moved to the suburbs of Oshawa and had 2 children. He worked as a traveling salesman for a clothing company and maintained a respectable suit and tie image. This was his proof. His family and the church involvement served as his shield. He used their normalcy to convince the world and himself that he wasn't different. In his late 40s, his manufactured life started to crumble. Bankruptcy and divorce forced him out of the suburbs and into Toronto's gay village. He found his bear community, where his age and size were celebrated rather than judged. He transformed from a suburban dad into a daddy persona, gaining a dangerous new level of ego and entitlement. The first warning, in 2001, he brutally attacked a man with a metal pipe. Despite the violence, he received a relative slap on the wrist, no jail time, teaching him that he could charm his way out of trouble, and then he needed to leave no witness the next time. McArthur operated his artistic design, the landscaping business, as the ultimate urban camouflage. He used the client's home at 53 Mallory Crescent to store his equipment. It was his graveyard. He dismembered the victims, and their remains were left at the bottom of large planters, planting flowers over the top of them. Homeowners unknowingly watered these graves for years. Then his Santa persona. Every winter, he worked as a mall Santa. He was beloved by families, often murdering men and dismembering them in the same weeks he was taking photos with children. McArthur targeted those who he believed were invisible: immigrants, refugees, and closeted men of color. Police investigated the first 3 disappearances, but were distracted by this bizarre international cannibal lead. In 2013, the police actually had him. Bruce McArthur was brought in for an interview. His name had surfaced because he had dated Skanda, one of the victims, and employed Mahid's son. Mahid was also one of the victims. Think about that scene. Bruce McArthur, the man who would eventually be known as Toronto's most prolific serial killer, is sitting in a police chair, but Bruce knew how to perform. He was the charming landscaper, the gentle grandfather. He admitted he knew the men, but gave a calm excuse about drifting apart, and leaned on his reputation as a pillar of the village. The police looked at his file. They saw the 2003 assault, but they dismissed it as an old glitch. They didn't see a predator upgrading his system. They saw a nice old man. They let him walk. In April 2014, Project Houston was quietly disbanded. The official word? No evidence of foul play. They suggested the men might have just moved, left their families, gone back to the closet. It was a dismissal that cut deep. It sent a message to the village: unless you're a white lawyer from the suburbs, your disappearance is a choice, not a crime. But the most chilling part isn't the failure of the past, it's what happened next. Because when the task force turned off the lights and went home, Bruce McArthur didn't stop. He felt invincible. 5 more men would die because the system preferred Hollywood cannibal story over the boring middle-aged truth. In this next part, we'll cover the ghost victims, 2015 to 2016. After nearly a 3-year gap, or at least a gap in evidence, McArthur began killing men who were even more marginalized, men who were homeless, addicted, or hiding from the government. His fourth victim, Sharush Mohammadi, age 50. He disappeared August 15, 2015. A refugee from Iran who was married. He struggled with mental health issues and was described by his family as being a gentle soul. It's unclear exactly how they met, but McArthur likely targeted him as a vulnerable figure in the area. His disappearance went largely unnoticed by the media compared to the others. His remains were identified, and the planters. Karishna Kumar Kamaratam, age 37. Sometime between September and December 15th is expected when he was murdered. He was a Sri Lankan asylum seeker. His claim for refugee status hadn't been denied, so he was living underground to avoid deportation. He worked off-the-book jobs and had no digital footprint. Because he was hiding, he was never reported missing. Police only identified him after McArthur's arrest by releasing a digitally enhanced image of his corpse, a sketch derived from McArthur's trophy photos, after asking the public for help. He was killed during the same holiday season McArthur was playing Santa. This is the 2015 season. Victim 6, Dean Lisowick, 47, April 23rd, 2016, is when he went missing. Dean was a fixture in the village but lived on the streets. He struggled with drug addiction and worked in the sex trade. He was known as a protector of other homeless youth. McArthur likely picked him up for sex, leveraging Dean's need for money and shelter. Because he was homeless and often out of contact, he was never reported missing. Police believe McArthur targeted him specifically because he thought. Now we move on to the tail end of his killing spree. In 2017, McArthur became restless. He killed 2 men in quick succession, and the choice of the final victim ultimately led to his downfall. Victim number 7, Salim Hussein, April 14, 2017. Salim was a Turkish national who had come to Canada to find acceptance. He struggled significantly with a drug addiction and was often seen walking the streets of the village with a small plastic suitcase. He met McArthur in the village area. McArthur likely preyed on his desperation and addiction issues. His disappearance happened just months before the next victim, Kinsman's disappearance, sparked the formation of Project Prism, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Victim 8, the final conical victim, Andrew Kinsman, 49, disappeared July 26, 2017. This was McArthur's mistake. Andrew was a superintendent of a building in Cabbagetown and was a well-known HIV/AIDS activist. They had a casual sexual relationship. On the day that he died, surveillance footage showed Andrew getting into McArthur's 2004 Dodge Caravan. Gross. He had a soccer mom car. Crucially, Andrew had remarked on his calendar for the day, Bruce. And when Andrew didn't show up to feed his cat or take his medication, his neighbors immediately knew something was wrong. Within 72 hours, the community was mobilizing. This rapid response is what allowed the police to secure the surveillance footage before it was deleted. This is one of the most critical and painful chapters of the story. It highlights the phenomenon known as missing white girl syndrome. But in this context, it manifests at a stark divide of how the justice system values the lives of marginalized men versus those who were seen as more fit or reliable and socially found in the society. Andrew was white. That's the takeaway. He was known to the community as an activist and had a stable job and a wide circle of friends who the social capital to make noise. So he was white. That's your main takeaway. The other guys were brown. He was white. That's why the police cared. So unlike the other victims, the years of wait and see for the search, it was immediate and intense. The South Asian and Middle Eastern LGBT plus community in Toronto was screaming that a predator was among them. They felt ignored, and history proves they were. When these men vanished, the police narrative often defaulted to transience. They suggested these men had simply walked away from their lives, perhaps because of the pressure of being gay in a conservative immigrant culture. The disparity in the response created a deep sense of betrayal in the village. Andrew Kinsman's death didn't just lead to McArthur's arrest, it invalidated the deaths of the 7 men that came before him. The police didn't start looking in earnest until the victim looked like someone they recognized. For 7 years, brown men were missing. When a white man disappeared, he was murdered. Let's talk about the lucky one that got away. This is the most terrifying near miss of the case. In July 2017, right at the height of the killing spree, a man named Sean Cribben met McArthur on a dating app. They met up, and McArthur offered him GHB, party drug. Cribben took it and blacked out. When Cribben woke up, he was groggy and confused, but alive. McArthur seemed agitated and abruptly kicked him out. It wasn't mercy. McArthur's roommate had unexpectedly come home early. The arrival of the roommate likely spooked McArthur, forcing him to abort his ritual. Sean Cribben walked out of that apartment thinking he just had a weird date. He went home, he lived his life, and complained to his friends about the rude guy that kicked him out. He didn't know that on the hard drive, just feet away from his head where he slept, his photo was already filled in the same file folders of 8 other dead men. He survived simply because a roommate figured out their keys or came home early. It reminds us the difference between a victim and a survivor is sometimes just a matter of minutes. All right, let's talk about Project Prism, the second task force, the one that actually took him down. The disappearance of Andrew Kinsman is the one that caused this task force to be formed. Unlike the victims in Project Houston, which were often closeted, marginalized, or immigrants with few local ties, Kinsman was prominent community and was an activist, and also white. He had a predictable routine. He had neighbors who checked on him. His disappearance caused more of an immediate uproar in the community. The police noticed similarities between the disappearance of that of Salim Hassan, who vanished 2 months prior. Both men frequented the village, but vanished without a trace. So the task force was officially formed in August 2017, specifically to investigate the disappearances of Kinsman and Hassan. Unlike Project Houston, which got lost in international cannibal theories, Project Prism focused on locals, boots-on-the-ground surveillance, and operated under the assumption that the serial killer was active. There's a piece of evidence that cracked the case. We talked about earlier how Kinsman had marked on the calendar, Bruce. Police entered Kinsman's apartment. It was untouched. His cat was hungry. His medication was still there. On the calendar for June 26, the day he vanished, Kinsman had wrote a single entry, Bruce. Investigators cross-referenced Bruce with a list of people interviewed in the failed Project Houston project years before. Bruce McArthur popped up. Once McArthur was identified as a person of interest, the investigation went into overdrive. Police found surveillance footage near Kinsman's apartment showing a 2004 red Dodge Caravan. Gross again. They traced the van to McArthur. They later found trace amounts of blood in the van. By late 2017, police were physically following McArthur. They tracked his movements to the Mallory Court Crescent's property, where the bodies were buried, and to the scrapyards where he disposed of an old car, which contained blood evidence. They obtained a general warrant to secretly enter his apartment and clone the drive. This is when they found the digital trophy room, the photos of the dead men. This is when the true horror began to unravel, not in a dark alley, but on a computer screen. When the police finally executed the warrant on Bruce's apartment, they found it in a hidden folder. Inside the hidden folder, images were horrific. Disturbing images of the victims, both alive and deceased. This wasn't just a record, it was a trophy cabinet. He had documented the faces of the men he killed, almost as if to prove they existed, even as he ensured no one would ever see them again. Let's talk a little bit more about the folders and the structure of the folders he had. He had a series of subfolders, each labeled with the first name of the victim. Inside each folder were photographs. Some of them were photos of the men while they're still alive, taken from their social media or dating profiles. And other photos were photos that McArthur had taken himself post-mortem. McArthur didn't just photograph the bodies where they fell, he staged them. He treated them like dolls, dressing them up in a specific fantasy. 2 items appeared repeatedly in the photos across different victims and across the years. The first was a sheepskin coat. Many victims were photographed wearing this large vintage sheepskin coat, and police found the exact coat inside McArthur's van. It wasn't a piece of clothing that the victims owned, it was a prop that McArthur carried with him. It suggested a hunter mentality, wrapping his kill in a pelt of animal skin. The second common thing was a cigar. In several photos, the victims were posed with a thick cigar in their mouths, sometimes The cigar was unlit. Sometimes it was taped in place. This is likely a symbol of hypermasculinity in the bear subculture MacArthur idolized. Cigars and leather and fur were all common signifiers of toughness and dominance. By forcing the dead victims to wear these items, he was molding them into his ideal partner forever. Unlike some serial killers who pose their bodies in violent or degrading ways, MacArthur's posing was more eerily peaceful, which made it even more grotesque. He often posed them to look like they were sleeping or resting. In some cases, he taped their eyelids open to make them look alive for the camera. The photos were not frantic snapshots, they were composed. He took time to set the scene. The digital trophy room is actually how victim number 5 was identified. Police found a folder with photos of a man they didn't recognize. He wasn't on any missing persons list. In a desperate move, police released a digitally altered version of one of the death photos to the public. They cleaned up the image to make him look like he was just closing his eyelids. The public eventually identified him as Krishna Kumar Karnataka. Now we jump to the action movie part of the case. Police were watching MacArthur's apartment building from the outside. They saw a young man, known only as John, enter the building with MacArthur. Knowing that MacArthur's pattern was violent and quick, and having seen the trophy photos on his computer, the officers on the scene made a split-second decision. They believed John was about to die. They couldn't wait for a warrant to show up for their arrest. They breached the door. They found John naked and handcuffed to the bed. MacArthur was arrested on the spot. Project Prism worked because it started with the answer the community had been screaming for years. The killer is among us. Project Houston spent 2 years looking for no reason for a red herring. Project Prism spent 5 months looking for the man who did it. The tragedy is that it took the disappearance of a well-known connected white advocate, Andrew Kinsman, to finally trigger the investigation that solved the murders of the 7 men who came before him. When police arrested MacArthur in January 2018, they knew he was a landscaper, but they yet did not know where the bodies were. The breakthrough came at the home in the Leaside neighborhood where MacArthur stored his equipment in exchange for free lawn care. Investigators focused on 12 large commercial-grade plastic planters sitting on the property. These weren't small flower pots, they were massive containers. Using portable x-ray machines and heaters to thaw the frozen soil, it was midwinter. Police began to discover the gruesome scene and the task of sifting through the frozen dirt. Inside the planters, they found skeletal remains that had been meticulously dismembered. To the horror of the community, 7 of the 8 victims were recovered from these pots. The recovery was not as simple as finding a body, because MacArthur had dismembered the victims. The forensic teams were dealing with a commingled site. Forensic scientists had to separate and categorize hundreds of bone fragments. They used dental records, DNA, and even surgical implants to identify the men. Specially trained cadaver dogs were used to sweep the entire backyard and surrounding woods. The dogs signaled over several areas leading to further investigations. The search eventually expanded far beyond Mallory Crescent because MacArthur's business, artistic design, had worked on hundreds of properties across Toronto. The police had to prioritize other places to dig. Police identified over 30 properties where MacArthur had done extensive work. In many of these homes, police had to remove patio stones, dig up gardens, and use ground-penetrating radar to ensure there was no other remains buried in the lawns and walkways. After months of searching, no other remains were found at the other properties. The concentration of the horror was almost entirely localized to the planters at 53 Mallory Crescent. The homeowners, Karen Fraser and Ron Smith, were forced out of their home for months as it became a global focal point. They had to watch as afar as their backyard, a place of peace, was dismantled by forensic teams. Karen said, "He had wonderful clients. He was kind and generous to them. I thought I made a deal, the best deal ever." As they say, if a deal is too good to be true, it often is too good to be true. Probably the most brazen part of MacArthur's double life was his social media. He wasn't hiding his Santa gig. He was proud of it. His Facebook picture profile was often him, rosy-cheeked in the red suit, his thick white beard perfectly groomed. He posted updates about the mall and shared stories about the children. Think about the audacity. When the village is plastered with posters of missing people, while families grieved, while he was dismembering bodies and planters, he was actively cultivating the image of jolly old Saint Nick. He didn't just hide his evil, he flaunted his benevolence. When the news broke, these images became the defining visual of the case. They ripped through the headlines. a chilling testament to how completely he'd fooled everyone. The monster was literally hiding in plain sight, wearing the most trusted disguise imaginable. Now that we're coming towards the end of the serial killing Santa's story, he made a plea deal. So there was no trial. There was a sentence hearing, February 2019. It became the moment of truth when the truth came out. The Crown prosecutor read, agreed statement of facts, a document detailing exactly what McArthur did. This is when the public learned about the digital trophy room, the staging of the bodies and fur coats, the cigars, and the specific mechanics of the dismemberment. There was victim impact statements. This is when the emotional core of the friends and families of the victims stood out, just feet away from McArthur, and they wept, they yelled, they spoke quietly about their loss. His reaction, he sat stone-faced. He didn't want to look at them. He didn't want to cry. He displayed zero emotion. The judge, Justice John McCann, read the automatic penalty. In Canada, first-degree murder carries an automatic sentence of life in prison with no parole for 25 years. The prosecution wanted the parole to be stacked, but it was handed down to be congruent. So Justice McMahon ruled that the sentence would be served concurrently, same time. Bruce McArthur was sentenced to life in prison with eligibility for parole after 25 years. Since he was arrested in 2018, he will be eligible for parole hearing in 2043. He'll be 91 years old. The public was furious. People felt he got a bulk discount on murdering 8 men, as the resulting sentence was considered light. Justice McMahon argued that a 67-year-old who has to wait 25 years for parole was effectively a death sentence anyway. He stated Mr. McArthur will likely die in a penitentiary. The judge also gave him credit for pleading guilty, which spared the families and the jury of the trauma of viewing the gruesome graphic evidence, the trophy photos, during the trial. But there's something visceral in the human brain that wants math to equal justice. If you kill 8 people, you should serve 8 sentences. When the judge announced the sentences were run congruently, the courtroom gasped. It felt like 7 of the men didn't count. Legally, the judge was right. McArthur will die in a cage. But emotionally, it feels like he got away with something. Bruce McArthur is currently serving his life sentence with no chance for parole for 25 years. He will likely die in prison, but the closing of the cell door doesn't close the wounds he left behind. In the wake of his arrest, Toronto had to look in the mirror, and the reflection was ugly. For decades, the gay village was a sanctuary. It was the one place where you didn't have to look over your shoulder, but McArthur turned that sanctuary into a hunting ground. He proved that the greatest threat wasn't a stranger in a dark alley, it was a nice guy buying you a drink. Today, the posters are gone, but the paranoia lingers. The community's relationship with the police, already strained, was shattered. How could a man be interviewed and released while he was still actively killing? The missing persons procedures in Toronto were completely overhauled after this case, but for many, it was too little, too late. Bruce McArthur's story is a terrifying reminder of the power of the mask. From the farm in Argyll to the mall in Scarborough, he spent 66 years perfecting a character that he wanted the world to see. He taught us that niceness is not the same thing as goodness. He taught us that the systems designed to protect us use massive human-sized blind spots. And most importantly, he taught us that even in the most vibrant, colorful neighborhoods, the darkest shadows are often cast by the people we trust the most. We like to believe that justice is blind. We tell ourselves that in the modern progressive city like Toronto, every life carries the same weight. But if you look at the timeline of Bruce McArthur, that lie falls apart. And that, my friends, that's the end of our case today. The case of Bruce McArthur, the serial killer mall Santa. Thank you for joining me in the dark. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with your friends and leave a 5-star review. It helps more than you know with the algorithm. And follow the show at Homicidal Tendency on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Tumblr. Yes, even Tumblr, for photos and media from today's case. We'll be back next week with a new case. Until then, remember, spill the tea, not the blood.